and welcome to another episode of Surrendered Birth Stories, birth education, and the pursuit of surrendering it all to God. Let's get started. When your first birth experience goes from a planned home birth to a preeclampsia diagnosis turned induction at 35 weeks with a NICU stay for your baby, it's hard to imagine wanting to give birth again. Join us today as we listen to Kristian tell her birth stories and how God was able to redeem her first traumatic birth with a quick and peaceful home birth the second time around. Well, welcome to another episode of Surrendered Birth Stories. I am excited to have a fellow triad birth worker with me here today. Kristian, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and your family and what you do?
Yeah, I'm so excited. Thank you for letting me be part of this. So, my name is Kristian Jordan. Like Kayla said, I'm a local birth doula. I've been a birth doula for almost 6 years. It's something that I started after the birth of my first child in 2017. So I worked with a large doula group for a while in the area and then decided to start my own business. And now I have my own business called Holistic Heritage Birth Services. And I have four other doulas working with me in the triad. And beyond birth doula services, we also provide postpartum doula services, birth tub rentals, placenta encapsulation, childbirth education, birth photography, postpartum meal preparation, and a few other things too.
You got them all. You got everything.
Try to be
You're
a
a
one-stop shop.
one-stop shop.
Yeah.
There it is.
Home birth midwife is the only thing that we haven't added yet. Maybe one day.
Just give it some time.
Maybe one day.
So you are here to share your birth stories today, which is exciting. So with that in mind, what was it like finding out you were pregnant for the first time?
I was so excited. My husband and I had planned to try to get pregnant, and praise Jesus, we did pretty quickly. And before we even got pregnant, I had been pretty convinced that I wanted to have a home birth, wanted to plan one. So I had already looked at local doulas. I had not reached out to any of them, but I had my eye on one particular doula. She also taught Bradley birthing method classes. So it was like a sort of a one-stop shop for me. I knew that that was the class that I wanted my husband and I to take. So yeah, so we found out we were pregnant. I guess it was on Christmas Day of 2016. I didn't tell my husband for a couple of days because I was waiting for a onesie to arrive that had like a special saying on it. So it just like ate me alive to have to keep the secret to myself for a couple of days. But I told him 2 days later when my gift had arrived, and he was also overjoyed. And it was just an exciting time for us.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, Christmas. What a special day to find out that
It's
you're
so
pregnant.
much fun. Yeah. It was the greatest Christmas gift for me. I hated that I couldn't tell him on Christmas, but it was also kind of a sweet little secret that I got to keep because you don't get to keep that secret to yourself very long.
Right. Well, I've always actually, my husband and I have always found out together.
Oh, I love that.
And so we've always I've taken the test, I put it in the bathroom, and then I run out, and
Okay.
then we go and look at it together.
Yeah.
Um, but I've thought so many times, I mean, I guess I've had four, so or five. I've thought so many times about surprising him with the pregnancy, but with his personality, I feel like he would just be I feel like
Well,
I feel like he went behind my back.
you've sort of got a tradition now, and
Yeah.
might be a little bit strange to break that tradition.
Right. Right. Okay. So that's cool though. I have always thought about what that would be like to not tell my husband until later. uh, okay. So you find out you're pregnant and then you get to tell your husband it's Christmas time. So you're thinking about a home birth.
Yes.
And how did you go about finding that home birth care provider?
Yeah. So the doula that I had been eyeing for a while, I reached out to her probably the next week after I found out I was pregnant, got through Christmas and then called her on the phone. And she was so sweet. She answered, and I was like, I want you to be my doula. And I need your recommendations for home birth midwives. So we started that communication, and she recommended two to me right away that she really liked working with. They were both certified nurse midwives. At the time, I didn't know the difference between certified nurse midwives and certified professional midwives and what that means in North Carolina specifically. So she sent me certified nurse midwives. And there was one in particular that she said, I really think that you would like her a lot. So I sort of booked my doula, booked some birth classes with her, and then reached out to this home birth midwife who had started a practice a few years prior. She had been a home birth, or she had been a midwife in hospitals and birth centers, and she had been a home birth midwife in another state. But she had started her North Carolina practice just a few years prior. So I got on the docket for her. She sent me all of sort of the initial information, getting all my health history. And then we just scheduled my first appointment for around, I think, 13 weeks pregnant. That's one of the differences with those home birth midwives is you generally don't have your first appointment until you're nearing that second trimester.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I found her. And I think that's a great way to find a care provider if you're specifically looking for home birth, is going through a doula, because doulas know the ins and outs of all the care providers in the area.
Right. They're a great resource for that kind of information because usually, at least in our state, you can't just Google it.
Yeah, it's so hard to find.
So, how was that pregnancy?
That pregnancy was not anything like I expected. I'll just preface this by saying that I just always assumed that I would have really wonderful pregnancies. My mom did. My mom doesn't really remember ever being nauseous. She said she felt better pregnant than not pregnant. So I just kind of like assumed that would be me. But I was not so lucky in that aspect. Around 5 weeks pregnant, I started getting really nauseous, and just nauseous like 24/7, where it would not let up anytime. And then shortly after started throwing up to the point where I was vomiting like 8 to 10 times a day. And one of the challenging parts of that was that I didn't know what was normal and what was not normal, especially as a first time mom. And having a home birth midwife who I really wasn't going to start seeing until around 13 weeks, I didn't recognize that maybe it was a problem and that I should have reached out and sought out some care ahead of time. So I just sort of dealt with it. I didn't know that there were options for medications and things that I could have taken. One of the blessings was that I wasn't a mom yet. So really, I could just kind of lay in bed all day and take care of myself and just sort of exist between the bed and the bathroom. And that's what I did for a long time. And looking back, I realized that that's probably not in the realm of normal, because normally morning sickness can be eased by some natural remedies. And there's lots of great suggestions for people who have normal morning sickness. But yeah, so I had that. And then I would say that the vomiting aspect of it probably eased up in the middle of pregnancy, maybe around 22, 23 weeks. And then I sort of had some time where I was just nauseous, but not sick. And my life kind of went back to normal for a little while. I really enjoyed being pregnant in the second trimester. Um, I had lost weight in the first trimester, and I was able to gain that back in the second and really just start taking care of my body again. So I loved being pregnant at that point because I was able to enjoy it a little bit more. And then around 26 weeks of pregnancy, I woke up in the middle of the night with a terrible pain in my upper abdomen, like below my breast, around my rib cage area. And so I called my midwife in the middle of the night, and she said, if the pain doesn't ease up in the next like 30 minutes to an hour, you should head to the ER. But if it does, like, try some different position changes, try to put a heating pad on it, see if something helps it. And so we did all those things, and it eased up and it went away. And so we just assumed maybe it was a rib or just the baby's positioning in some way. So I went to my chiropractor and got an adjustment, and we just sort of put it out of our minds. And then a few weeks later, the same exact thing happened again, except it lasted a little bit longer that time. And so after these issues that I was having came on maybe around 5 or 6 times, I started doing all the Googling things, like trying to figure out what is this? Is it really a rib that's coming out of place from my pregnancy? That just doesn't sound like that's what it could be. And so I kind of narrowed it down and figured out that it seemed like I was having gallbladder attacks. I had never had gallbladder issues. I don't really have family history of gallbladder issues. So it seemed so random and out of nowhere, but it lined up with the symptoms I was experiencing and how long they were lasting. And apparently, gallbladder problems are very common in pregnancy, which is not something I knew ahead of time. So my midwife set me up with a appointment at a local hospital to have an ultrasound of my liver and gallbladder area done. And I did that, and it did confirm that I had some pretty significant gallstones that had formed and that I was, in fact, having gallbladder attacks. But at that point, they were not causing any issues to my liver. And so they recommended I just wait until the pregnancy was over and that we could reassess and hopefully things would just ease up by themselves because a lot of times they do. The gallbladder attacks will go away once you're no longer pregnant. So I was willing to do that because surgery was not really something I wanted to have to consider during pregnancy. There's a lot of risks to that. So I just went on, and the gallbladder attacks continued to get worse and more frequent, to the point where around 32 weeks, every time I would get one, they would last about 15 to 20 hours at a time. So looking back, it was like I got a lot of practice for labor before labor ever actually began. They would keep me awake in the middle of the night. I couldn't eat during them, couldn't really retain fluids during them. And it was the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. Um, and that's after birthing two children. I would still say that it was far worse than anything I've ever felt. And I would hope nobody would ever have to get them. They're horrible. So anyway, around 34 weeks, my midwife did a visit at my home and found that I was spilling a little bit of protein in my urine. And my blood pressure had started to creep up just a little bit, not to the point of major concern, but just with those two things put together, she wanted me to go in and get some blood work done and to get urine sample for proteinuria, which is a sign of preeclampsia if you're spilling a lot of protein into your urine. So I did a couple of those tests, which is where you basically collect your urine for 24 hours and then they send it off to the lab and they measure how much protein is in your urine. And I did that two separate times, a few days in between each of those tests, and the number just went like skyrocketed high. And so with that, my midwife felt that I was risking out of home birth at that point between the gallbladder issues and now what seemed to be this creeping on preeclampsia. She requested that we transfer my care to a local hospital. So that's what we decided to do.
And that
To
was at 34 weeks?
This was at 35 weeks at that point after all those tests had been done.
Okay.
Yeah. So around 35 weeks, that is when I found out I wouldn't be having a home birth and I would need to give birth in the hospital. And those days were just whirlwinds. Like my whole world felt like it was crashing down. Everything I'd planned for and hoped for was not going to be happening. And I was going to be in this foreign place with foreign providers. I didn't know anybody. So we looked online and found that the hospital was going to be having a tour of labor and delivery. And it was like the only one before my due date, and it was coming up in just a few days. So we signed up for it, and we decided to go. And on the way there, my husband was with me. My home birth midwife texted me just to check in, see how I was feeling that day. And I told her that I had had a headache and I'd had some nosebleeds that day. And she was like, "Oh, I don't love that. Those aren't great things." So I'm glad you're going to the hospital for your tour. After your tour, I want you to stop by labor and delivery triage, and I'm going to call them and tell them to be expecting you. And so, in no way did I have on my radar that this meant like I might not be going home. I
Mm.
was thinking she just wants me to get checked out and make sure I'm okay. So we did the tour,
So
and then
wait, had you actually seen a hospital provider yet at this point?
the only one I had seen was maternal fetal medicine when I had gone for the gallbladder things. So,
Okay, so we hadn't like totally transferred care yet.
correct.
We were waiting. Okay, gotcha, gotcha. So you didn't have like an induction scheduled yet or anything
Yeah.
like that. Okay,
Yeah, because I had not been officially diagnosed with preeclampsia yet by a hospital provider. My
gotcha.
midwife had been in the works of, like, transferring paperwork and getting an appointment set up for me, so none of that had happened yet.
Okay, so now you're 36 weeks when this is happening.
35 and 6.
Okay,
35 and 5, 35 and 5,
you're almost 36 weeks.
almost 36. So we went through the tour of labor and delivery. And then we stopped by triage on the way. I had dinner plans picked out for after we left the hospital. We knew what restaurant we were going to. I was unprepared for what was about to happen. So they hooked me up to monitors and they took some blood work and they were monitoring my blood pressure. And the providers come back in the room a couple of hours later and say that my liver levels were really high, like astronomically high, to the point where if we don't do something about it, my liver is going to start shutting down. And my blood pressure's numbers were not so high that you usually see with preeclampsia, but they were elevated for me, which they were concerned about. And then, of course, the protein in my urine had gone up even higher than it had been in my tests the days before. So, with those things combined, they technically had to consider me as severely preeclamptic. And not knowing what the gallbladder issues were causing and not causing, it was really hard to know to just navigate that.
Mhm.
So, their recommendation was to get induced immediately, which of course was not something I wanted to do. I was hungry. I wanted to go
Oh
to
man.
dinner. I wanted to go to We didn't have our hospital bags packed, nothing. It was just all so fast. So anyway, we consented to it, and I just asked for some time to think about it, and think about what methods of induction I was comfortable with trying and not trying. So, ironically, they wheeled us to the exact same room that we had just toured. So that was the room that I gave birth in.
Oh,
Um,
that's funny.
yeah. So when we got in there, I just asked. Well, I needed to make phone calls to tell everybody what was going on because at this point, none of our families knew. My doula didn't know. I just needed some time to process it and talk to people that I trusted.
Hmm.
So anyway, we ended up asking, thankfully, I was already having some contractions that they were picking up on the monitor. I couldn't feel them. And I was 1 centimeter dilated, which was a huge blessing in disguise looking back. I didn't realize at the time how much of a blessing that was, um, for a first time mom at 35 weeks to be 1 centimeter. But it allowed me the opportunity to ask for a Foley bulb, which is what I asked for instead of cervical ripening medication. I opted for just the Foley bulb to start the induction, and I just wanted to see what my body would do with something a little less heavy than like Cervidil or Cytotec.
Okay, so let's pause there and say, for the people who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what preeclampsia is and why you would choose to get induced if you have it rather than just letting the pregnancy continue?
Yes. So with preeclampsia, you usually have some or all of these factors: high levels of protein in the urine, decreased blood platelets, trouble with kidneys or liver, fluid in the lungs, signs of brain trouble such as seizures and or visual disturbances, and then the higher blood pressure numbers. And with the risk of preeclampsia continuing on is that you can start running into the risk of seizures and strokes happening. Stillbirth is increased with moms with preeclampsia. And eclampsia. It can get to eclampsia. And I'm not exactly sure what the factor is of it moving into eclampsia, but thankfully, most moms don't have that issue.
Let your organs start shutting down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, unfortunately, it can lead to moms dying as well if it's not treated properly.
Right. If it gets really severe.
Yes.
So, most cases, typically, like, I don't know how many percent of the time, but the vast majority of cases resolve themselves as soon as the baby is born.
Absolutely. They do monitor moms more closely who've had preeclampsia, and some moms actually don't develop preeclampsia until after they give birth.
Hmm.
I think I read that up to a few weeks after birth, you're at risk of preeclampsia. So it's a very interesting thing, and there's still a lot of unknowns about preeclampsia. Even in 2023, there's still so much we don't know about it. But thankfully, we have the tools to detect it and can make decisions for ourselves and our babies that we feel best.
Right. So, you chose a very wise choice to get induced so that you didn't get any worse.
Yeah, I think what, scared me the most was the fact that my liver was no longer tolerating being pregnant well.
Right.
Um,
We
I
need
think
our livers.
absolutely, absolutely. When an organ starts, failing on you, that's a problem.
Okay. So you're calling everybody, you're letting everybody know.
Yeah.
You never got to leave the hospital and eat your restaurant food. Now you're going to be starving for a while.
Yes.
Oh, and go ahead and explain then what the Foley bulb is.
Okay. So the Foley bulb is a catheter that has a little balloon on the end of it, and they insert the catheter into through your vagina into your uterus, and then they fill the bulb with sterile water. And what it does is it manually holds your cervix open. I'm sorry, I said they insert into your.
Uterus.
I meant
You
they're
meant
your
cervix.
cervix. Sorry. It manually holds your cervix open to about 4 centimeters, and then what that's supposed to do is stimulate your body to start producing the hormones that it needs during labor. So you're trying to um, produce the prostaglandins and the oxytocin. And when your cervix is being manually stimulated in that way and held open, it often does that for itself.
Mhm.
So that I opted for that. I just felt better about that decision than the cervical ripening medicine that they can use, and the side effects that can come along with that. I just felt better. And thankfully, my body responded well to the Foley bulb. A lot of women have really bad pain with Foley bulbs. Mine was nothing worse than like menstrual type cramping. So we started the Foley bulb, I want to say around 11:30 that night. Um, I sort of held it off as long as I could, and all my phone calls took a while and everything. So anyway, we started that, and maybe around 3 hours into having the Foley bulb in, the provider came in and asked me about starting Pitocin. That was something we had talked about before, and I just told them I knew I was probably going to need it at some point, especially as a first time mom, but I just wanted to see what my body would do by itself first. So I was in a pretty active contraction pattern, but they were not very intense for me. So around 2 a.m., it was 2 or 2:30, we started Pitocin on a low dose, and they would come in every 30 minutes and up it just a little bit.
And what does the Pitocin do? What is that?
Pitocin is a synthetic form of oxytocin, which is the love hormone. That's what we need during labor to dilate effectively and, yeah, just to birth our babies. So if your body is not producing it, or if you're getting induced, you need to sort of trick your body into producing this hormone. And so um introducing Pitocin is one of the common ways to do that for an induction.
And it will cause contractions if you're not having them, theoretically.
Yes, hopefully, if your body responds to it. Thankfully, my body did respond to it, and I got into a super active labor pattern with very intense contractions. I don't remember exactly the time that my Foley bulb fell out. I wish I could remember that. Um, but I do remember them saying, "Your Foley bulb is out, so that means you're at least 4 centimeters dilated," which is fantastic. So I labored all through the night with Pitocin, and I think around 11 a.m., my water broke on its own.
Well, that's good.
I remember just, like, laying in bed, feeling a pop and a gush all of a sudden, and I was like, "Oh, I think my water just broke." And they confirmed that it had. So one of the, tricky parts about my induction was that I really couldn't get out of bed. I was considered a fall risk because they had also started me on magnesium, a magnesium IV.
For your blood pressure.
Yes, for blood pressure, and that is used sometimes, in labor if you're having higher blood pressure readings because the magnesium drip can help prevent strokes and seizures during labor. And once you're on it, they usually want you on it for at least 24 hours after labor as well. So the magnesium truly was probably the worst part of my labor experience. I felt like I had a sunburn with it.
Mm.
It made me queasy and I vomited a couple of times with it. And the worst part about it is it made me very loopy. So I honestly felt drugged. That's how I would describe that feeling, I guess. Um, and because I was a fall risk on magnesium, I wasn't allowed to get out of bed. So it was like having an epidural without an epidural.
Oh, that's
Um,
the worst.
Yes. So praise Jesus for my doula. I just remember the moment she walked in the room, I felt like an angel had walked in my room. And my husband was with me and my mom was with me. And, of course, my mom had given birth and my husband took the birthing classes with me. But something about my doula walking in the room made me feel so seen
Mm.
because she knew the birth that I had planned. And this was nothing like what I had planned and envisioned. And she just sort of stepped in and started suggesting different positions for me to get in and doing counter pressure. And she put a TENS unit on my back. And my labor was to the point where I was so loopy, I could not even really speak for myself. And so having her there made me feel safe. I knew that I had that advocate on my side, that if something came up that she knew I would want to be aware of, she would bring that to my attention. And I felt like I could let go at that point a little bit of trying to be super aware of what was going on in the room. So yeah, I should have said that, but she arrived around 7 a.m. So I labored with her for quite a few hours. Um, they came in the room around 12 p.m., not long after my water had broken, and they did a cervical exam. At that time, I was just not really aware of, like, what I could ask for and what I could not ask for as far as cervical exams went, and I had started feeling some pressure, apparently, I don't remember this, but I started feeling some pressure, so they came and checked me, and I was complete. So, the midwife that we got that day said, "Okay, you can start pushing now." And I wasn't really in the right mindset of thinking, "Oh, I can just wait until this is an overwhelming urge and I can't do anything about it." So we started very, very coached pushing
Mhm.
on the hospital bed. And in retrospect, I would change so much about that if I was aware enough to do that and kind of went in with more knowledge about it. But we did the whole, like, count to 10, bear down. I felt like my face was going to explode.
You did the epidural pushing.
I did the epidural pushing without the epidural. Exactly, exactly. Um, and I pushed for around an hour and a half before he was born. So, something that I love about my birth is that we had really desired for my husband to catch our baby when we had planned a home birth. We had talked about that with the midwife, and she was very much in agreement that we could try to make that happen. So then when we were getting induced in the hospital, of course, I was like, well, they're not going to be okay with this. But the midwife that was on call that day, we talked to her about it, and she was like, absolutely, we can make that happen.
Oh.
So she sat at the end of the bed with my husband and sort of walked him through helping to catch our son as I was pushing him out. And we have pictures of my husband's face during that, and it's forever etched in my memory. He was so excited, and he loved being part of that, and I just remember looking up at him while I was pushing and drawing so much strength from looking into his eyes and seeing his excitement and him encouraging me and telling me I was doing a good job.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Aw. Well, that sounds like then it went I know it wasn't enjoyable, but it sounds like it went relatively smoothly for an induction with a first-time mom at, 35 and 5, because easily that could have ended in a C-section. You know what I mean? Like, statistically speaking,
Yes.
the odds were stacked against you.
Yes, they were. And praise Jesus, I did not know that. If I had been in birth work already, I would have known that. And I honestly think that I would have gone in with a lot more fear than I did.
Yeah.
So I actually did not know about the odds during that time, and I think that that worked in my favor.
It sounds like it did. So then how, with having a preemie at that point, how was he physically? Like, how was his health when he came out?
So physically at birth, he was great. I don't remember his APGAR scores. I could look back in my notes, but I don't remember. But he was great. I mean, he came out crying, he pinked up so quickly. The only concern that they had was his temperature. So I was able to do some initial breastfeeding latching with him, which was fantastic. My doula helped me with that. But around an hour after he was born, they came back in and checked his temperature again, and it was a little lower than what they wanted to see it at. So we advocated and asked for my husband to do skin to skin with him for a little while. My husband is naturally warmer than I am. He's like a space heater. I was like, if anything in this room can warm my baby up, it's him. So my husband did skin to skin and around 15 minutes of it. And then they checked his temperature again and they still didn't like what they were seeing. So in a whirlwind, they were like, we need to take him to the NICU. And they just took him out of our room, and my husband followed, and my mom stayed with me, and it was such a shock because we had spent that first hour with him, and then all of a sudden, he was not in the room with us anymore, and I couldn't go with him since I was on magnesium.
Mm, oh gosh, that's heartbreaking. So, how long did you have to wait to see him after they took him from you?
So because I was on the magnesium, I wasn't allowed to get out of bed while that was dripping, and I had to be on it for another 24 hours after birth. So was able to see him when they wheeled me from the labor and delivery room to my postpartum mother baby room. I asked if they could stop me by to see him, and they did. And so I was in a wheelchair at that point, one of the hospital wheelchairs. And while I was in the NICU with him, I'd only been there a couple of minutes. They really wanted to get me to postpartum as soon as possible. So I wasn't really allowed to stay in there. But while I was in there, he stopped breathing once. And my husband tells me that all the color drained from my face. And he was like, she's going to pass out. You need to help her. And so they got me to the mother baby room and into the bed very quickly. So that was the only time I got to see him after birth from the time they wheeled him to the NICU until about 30 hours after he was born was when we were finally able to join with him in our room. So he was in the NICU for a little over 24 hours. They just wanted to monitor and stabilize his temperature, and then the breathing, apparently he stopped breathing one other time in the NICU. So once I got into postpartum, it was breastfeeding was a really important goal of mine, and especially because I had been able to get that initial latch, I wanted to make sure that I was doing everything I could to get milk to him because I really advocated for him not receiving formula in the NICU. And so of course then they want to see that you are giving them something. So I had never used the breast pump before, and I will never forget my nurse. I asked her if she would help me, and she sat there and helped me. She brought me a hospital grade pump, and she just sat with me during my first pumping session, teaching me all about the different parts of the pump and how to work it. And how to, stimulate a letdown. And I will never forget that act of service that she did not have to do for me, because it made me feel very seen and that she would take the time to do something that was important for me. So I started pumping pretty immediately, and my mom and my husband would take shifts between me and the baby in the NICU. My son's name was Rafe, by the way. So they would go back and forth between me and Rafe. My husband would come and I would send my pumped milk with him, and he would take it to the NICU, and my mom would come back and be with me. So that way I wasn't alone, but our baby also was there, not alone, and also with an advocate since I couldn't be there with him.
Hmm. So how long was he in the NICU? How long were you guys at the hospital before you guys got the green light to go home?
So he joined us from the NICU about 30 hours after birth. And at that point, the only thing they were monitoring were his jaundice levels. He had gotten some jaundice that they weren't loving. That's pretty common in premature babies and breastfed babies. And there were just a lot of factors that contributed to his jaundice. And excuse me, I can't remember what the numbers are, but they want to see it over a certain number before you get released to go home. So that was really the only thing holding us at the hospital. At that point, my blood pressure was stabilized enough. I was stabilized enough. It was really just him that they were watching. So I gave birth on a Monday, and I was induced on a Sunday, gave birth on a Monday, and we did not go home until Friday afternoon. So every day they were monitoring his jaundice, still not loving what they saw. They introduced Billy Rubin lights to him, so we had to let him lay under the Billy Rubin lights with just a diaper on, and he had this little, like, eye mask on, to protect his eyes from the lights, and it was so hard to just sit there and, like, watch your naked baby under the lights when you just wanna hold them, but at the same time, you wanna be able to take him home, and so it's the battle of, "We have to do this, otherwise we're gonna be here longer than we wanna be."
Right. How do you think that entire scenario, like not having the home birth, being blindsided by an induction, then having your baby taken from you, how did that all affect you emotionally? Did that affect your postpartum period, do you think?
It really did. I can't say what my postpartum would have been like with a home birth if it had gone very smoothly, because 'cause I'll never know
Right.
what that would look like, but it absolutely affected me. It affected my self-esteem. It definitely made me not trust my body at all, and I had been someone that was very in tune with her body for a long time. So between preeclampsia and the gallbladder issues, I just felt not like myself at all, and like I really just couldn't trust myself. So we finally got to go home, and I will say that the first 4 months postpartum were so dark for me. I felt trapped and alone. I felt like there was this dark cloud that was just hanging over me, and everybody was living their life around me, and it was like I was screaming out silently and nobody could hear me. Um, Probably one of the darkest times in my life, and I everything in me wanted to be joyful and knew that I should be happy that I have this beautiful baby, that I'm alive and he's alive, and right, like, we should be grateful when we have those gifts, but for some reason, everything just felt like it was crashing around me. I ended up having more gallbladder attacks postpartum. I had hoped that they would resolve, but around 4 weeks 3 weeks postpartum, I was on probably my 4th gallbladder attack since he had been born,
Mm.
and every time I would have one, I would have to call my husband home from work because I couldn't even pick Rafe up during one, it was so painful. He would have to hold Rafe to my breast for me to nurse while I was having an attack. So finally, during that one, I called Paul home from work and I said, "I can't do this anymore. My quality of life is just awful at this point. We have to do something." And as much as I did not want to have surgery, especially postpartum, it seemed like the only option to sort of be able to move on from this whole thing. So, my mom kept our 3-week-old overnight for us, and we went back to the hospital, through the ER, and I had surgery 12 hours later. And it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made for myself, but also one of the hardest decisions because I went back to the same hospital I had just given birth at, and I was still very traumatized by the birth. And walking back into that same space just felt so eerie to me. And then leaving a newborn, not knowing how my body's going to react to surgery was very scary for me. Thankfully, the surgery went really smoothly, and my health got so much better after that. My quality of life went higher. I was able to actually enjoy my baby instead of being consumed by pain. But it still did take a couple of months for me to feel like I was in a new normal. I would have nightmares at night, and I didn't know how to express those to anybody because I was so afraid if I shared it, it would make me look crazy and my baby would get taken from me. But I was having dreams that, like, my baby was dying in weird ways, like in a washing machine. That is not in the realm of normal for postpartum. And again, the challenging part was I was a first-time mom. I didn't really have anybody alongside me who I trusted enough to share these things with outside of my husband. And my husband also did not know what's normal and what's not normal. And so we really just didn't have an advocate for us in that season to say, hey, it would be okay for us to go talk to somebody because this is not normal for you. And I think it all just it culminated for me in I was grieving something that I felt like I had lost, which was the birth experience I had hoped and planned for. I was grieving the fact that I felt like I couldn't trust my body anymore. It had sort of betrayed me, it really felt like. And I was grieving that I wasn't enjoying postpartum and having my baby here in the way that I felt like I should be able to. So it it took a long time to feel like life was good again, and it took me a very long time to even consider another pregnancy or birth because I had to work through so much. I had to wrestle through things with myself, but also with God because I had felt very forgotten, if that makes sense. And I knew logically that the Lord had not left my side. But in those times, it's so easy to feel that way.
Oh, yeah. So that's what I was about to ask is if, any of this affected your relationship with the Lord. Because I know sometimes going through really dark times like that, you can feel like, why, God? Like, why me, Lord? Why, why is this happening to me? What did I do? So how long of a process was that for you wrestling with the Lord over everything that happened?
Probably, truthfully, a couple of years.
Hmm.
Um, it's so, this is, I'm 6 years removed from this experience now. And it's amazing how much the Lord can heal in that amount of time and how much good can happen and how much you can learn from things and see things differently. I used to think about and talk about Rafe's birth, and I would immediately be drawn to tears. I would just sob because it took me back to this dark place in my life that I never wanted to go back to. Um, and I just didn't love that it was my story. But so Rafe was born in August 2017. And in January of 2018, so just 6 months later, I just felt this overwhelming call into birth work, specifically doula work. My doula had made such a big difference in my experience that I wanted to do the same thing for other families. And I'm also a person that if I fear something or um, if something is really hard for me, the best way for me to help it is by sort of facing it head on instead of cowering away from it and not thinking or talking about it. I need to walk through it over and over and over again to make sense of it. So by entering birth work, I was able to enter into other people's birth spaces and their stories and see all these different kinds of birth experiences and that is what the Lord used to start healing me from mine. And it was around 2 years after Rafe's birth that the Lord led me back to the same hospital I had given birth at, in the same room that I had given birth to Rafe in, with one of my dear friends who had hired me to be her birth doula. And that, I would say, was sort of the catalyst of when I finally felt like I'm okay with this being my story, and I see the blessings that I didn't see at the time. I see how the Lord has used my story and my experience to pour into other people and to educate other people and also help walk through other people's pain with them, because there have been births I've been at as a doula that did not go the way that the mom had planned or wanted for them to go. And having the empathy for that is something that I'm very grateful for now. If I had not had a birth like that, it would be a lot harder for me to understand where she's coming from. So I look back and I am able to not be drawn to tears anymore when I talk about his birth and see all the good that came from it in the last 6 years.
That's amazing. But that's not the end of the story.
It's not.
So after that point,
Yeah, so around that time of 2 years, 2.5 years, something like that, my husband and I started talking about another baby. It took a long time for my heart to be open to doing that again. And honestly, I love the title of your podcast and your business, because surrendering is what I had to do.
mhm,
Without surrendering myself to the Lord to do this again and to just trust him in that, I would have probably never had another baby, if I'd closed myself off in that way. So I knew again that if I got pregnant, I would love to plan for another home birth and just make sure that we monitor really closely for preeclampsia. I had also done a lot of research at that point about preeclampsia and ways that you can help prevent it. I didn't know that there were ways you could prevent it, but there are, and there's a lot of interesting theories about what causes preeclampsia. One of them is that preeclampsia is caused by your blood volume expansion not happening in the way that it's supposed to during pregnancy. So, in the first and second trimesters, your blood volume expands by 50% during pregnancy, during a healthy pregnancy. And they have found in moms with things like preeclampsia, that their blood volume expansion is not at the level that it should be. And it causes issues with the placenta and with just the mom in general, and the pregnancy. So the theory is that the blood volume expansion is solely done by what you are consuming. Your diet alone plays the biggest part in blood volume expansion. And so if you are not eating well and nourishing your body in the way that it's supposed to be, your body is going to suffer because of that. And it can cause a host of problems. And that made sense to me because I had struggled, especially in the first trimester in my first pregnancy, with all the vomiting, and I had lost weight, and so I knew that my body was probably not healthy at all. So it made sense to me that that is probably the cause of my preeclampsia. So going into a second pregnancy, we got pregnant in February of 2020,
mhm.
right before the
Yay.
world knew about COVID, right? Oh, people used to call my daughter, her name is Lorelai, our COVID baby, but she wasn't our COVID baby. She was conceived before we even knew what COVID was.
Mhm.
But that was a very unique pregnancy because of the timing of it.
Right.
Um, but again, I'm able to look back and see how the Lord used that, because when the whole world was shut down, it really didn't matter to me because my focus was on my baby and being as healthy as I could be for her. So I started something in the second pregnancy called the Brewer diet. And the Brewer diet was created by Dr. Brewer. And he is the one who did all the research behind the blood volume expansion in pregnancy. And so he created this diet, and it's not a restrictive diet at all. It's a lot of food, but
Hmm.
there's like categories of food, and you're supposed to have a certain number at least of that category each day. And there's a heavy focus on protein, healthy fats, healthy carbs in it, but especially the protein. And eggs and milk are huge things in that diet.
And salt, right? Like real salt,
Real salt, yes.
not table salt, real salt with the minerals.
Yes, the good stuff. So, with the second pregnancy, I still had the nausea and vomiting like I did with Rafe, but I decided to take a combination of a Unisom and vitamin B6, which when you combine those things, they can drastically help with morning sickness symptoms. So it took me from, you know, vomiting all day, every day, down to maybe once or twice a day, which was so much more manageable because then I was actually retaining food. I
Yeah.
didn't lose weight in that pregnancy. So I started out the pregnancy a lot differently than my first. And I had more knowledge, I had more ammo to work with, and I had done my research. So I found a certified professional midwife for that pregnancy. She was somebody that was in a circle of people that I knew. I knew some of her clients, and I knew some people that worked with her and spoke very highly of her. So I reached out to her, and she agreed to take me on as her client. And yeah, she walked with me on my pregnancy journey. And that was my hardest pregnancy journey because it was filled with some uncertainty and fear about how it would end.
Mm.
And will I get preeclampsia again? And so she was fantastic, just walking alongside me the whole way, helping me work through some insecurities I still had and some fears as they came up. Um, and yeah, she was wonderful.
And did you have any gallbladder issues in that pregnancy?
Since I didn't have a gallbladder, no.
They took it all the way out. Okay.
Yes.
I honestly didn't know whether they just removed the stones or they removed the whole
Oh,
bladder
I'm
itself.
sorry. They did remove the whole gallbladder, at 3 weeks postpartum.
Oh, well, then there you go. No more
Exactly.
issues there.
At least I knew I wouldn't have to deal with gallbladder issues.
Okay, so new midwife, she's helping you walk through this pregnancy. We have all the nausea and vomiting again, but it's being handled a little bit better with the B6 and Unisom.
Yes.
And as the end of the pregnancy approaches, how was your blood pressure? Did you have any signs of preeclampsia at all?
So I didn't have signs of preeclampsia outside of a couple of higher blood pressure readings and like mildly elevated blood pressure readings, not to the point where my midwife was concerned about them. And with preeclampsia, you usually don't see like a random blood pressure number go higher and then it stabilizes and goes back down. You're usually seeing like it's maintaining higher numbers.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it for me, truthfully, was anxiety about the time frame. Going past the time that I was when I was induced with Rafe was a big goal for me. So getting past that 36-week mark was like a victory. But I also knew from everything I read that when you have had preeclampsia and you get it again, the longer your pregnancy goes on, the more likely you are for it to creep back up on you. So I had this a little bit of uncertainty of I want to trust my body to go into labor on its own, but at the same time, if I get to 41 weeks and all of a sudden my body wreaks havoc and I get preeclampsia again, then I am looking at another hospital induction. So, my midwife and I had talked about this a lot during pregnancy, and she agreed and gave me her blessing to start trying some natural things around 37 weeks to encourage my body that if it was ready, it could go into labor and we would be fine with it. So I started doing evening primrose oil inserted vaginally at night. I went for some acupuncture and some chiropractic care. I did a couple of induction massages with a local massage therapist. Just those kind of like gentle things. I didn't want a membrane sweep, I didn't want to do anything super invasive, but those little hints to your body of, okay, we're ready anytime now.
Mhm.
Um, so at 38 8 weeks and 3 days, my doula, I hired the same doula again that I had with my first. She came over and took me on a really brisk walk. Like, I call it the walk from you know where. It was November and it was cold and,
She take you on some hills?
yeah, hills. It was like a 2-mile walk, and I was pushing a stroller, but my son didn't wanna sit in the stroller. He wanted to run ahead with my doula and her dog, so I was, like, trying to keep up behind them. So, I was not a happy pregnant lady on that walk, let me tell you. But that night, I was sitting on the couch eating a bowl of ice cream with my legs crossed, and I felt pop.
Oh.
And I felt like a gush and I stood up and it kept gushing and I was like, "Oh, that's my water." Like, I know I didn't just pee myself that bad. So it was about 11 o'clock at night. And so I called my midwife. I had just seen her for an appointment that day. So it was so funny. It was just a few hours after I'd seen her. And I called her and I said, "My water just broke." And she said, and at that point I was a doula, so I knew what to do. She was like, "You know what to do?" I said, "Yes, I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to get some sleep and I'll call you if anything changes." So we went to bed and I did not sleep well that night, but I'd also not been sleeping well at that stage of pregnancy anyway. So it
Right.
wasn't really different. Um, and I got up the next morning, no contractions at all. So I decided to manually try to pump a little bit of breast milk just to see if that would stimulate some contractions. And it did, but they were very mild and they sort of fizzled out. So that afternoon, my midwife came over and she did like the amnio swab to see, like, to confirm that my water had broken. And very oddly, she swabbed it 3 separate times and it did not show as positive for amniotic fluid. We know it was my amniotic fluid. We're not really sure if maybe, like, my baby's head was positioned in a way where, like, it was blocking a good
Yeah.
sample. I have no idea. I just knew my water had broken, and I trusted that. Um, but while she was here, we decided to do some, she did check me while she was doing that, and I was 4 centimeters
Oh,
and
nice.
70% effaced. So even though I wasn't in labor, that was a great place to start labor.
Yeah.
So we did some herbal tinctures while she was here, some black and blue cohosh, and those were just like tinctures that you drop under your tongue, and those can stimulate contractions.
That you should only do under the care of a midwife.
Yes, and one of the reasons that you want to do that only under the care of a midwife, which is why she stayed, during the times I was doing it, is because it can raise your blood pressure. So in someone who has had blood pressure spikes before, we wanted to really monitor. So I would take a dose and she would take my blood pressure, and we did that, I think there was like 3 times that we did it. And no contractions started while she was here. So she told me that she was gonna go home and she wanted me to take a bath and then take a nap. Just in case labor started later that night, she wanted me to have some rest. So my husband took my son to the park. I took a bath. I got in bed, and about 30 minutes into my not so restful nap, contractions started. And while I was laying there, it didn't really take long. They got to the point where I was feeling that I wanted the TENS unit on my back because I was feeling those contractions in my back quite a bit. So I asked my husband to come home and put the TENS unit on my back, and he did. And I was supposed to go for another induction massage that afternoon. And I ended up canceling it because I didn't want to drive and go be at a massage 30 minutes away if I was in labor. But I also didn't know if I was in labor. It was very tricky to know. Um, and I should back this up and say that about a week leading up to labor, I had had contractions almost every night, and they would last for a couple of hours, and then they would go away. So this was a time where I was like, "Maybe that might happen again. These contractions have started, but they're probably gonna stop in a couple of hours." So
Yeah.
I didn't call anybody. I didn't even let my midwife know that contractions had started. I didn't tell my doula. Only my husband knew. And then I called my mom and I said, "Mom, can you come over to watch Rafe? Because I'm having some contractions, but I'm just not convinced it's labor yet. But having you here would help Paul be with me." And that should have been my, like,
If you
tipping
need Paul
point,
to
like,
be with
see
you.
if I need my husband beside me that I might actually be in labor, but no, I was still very oblivious, and I have heard this before that birth workers make terrible clients
Mhm.
because we know too much.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I was just afraid to call my birth team in too early. My doula knew that I was supposed to have an induction massage, and so she texted me and asked me how it went. And I texted her back and said, "Well, I canceled it because I'm having some contractions." And she called me on the phone immediately. And she heard me having a contraction. I was moaning on the phone. And
Oh.
she said, okay, I'll be right there." And I was like, "No, no, it's gonna go away. It's not gonna, I'm not actually in labor." Well, on the way here, thankfully she only lived 5 minutes away from me. On the way to my house, she calls the whole birth team and says, "Christian's in labor. You need to get here now." And my midwife was like, "Have her lay down." They were like, "This is gonna go quick."
Stall it, yeah.
Um, because with my induction, with my first, it was only 13 hours from beginning to birth, which for a first time I'm induction, that's actually a very short
Right.
amount of time. So the assumption was that I would probably give birth fairly quickly the second time. So my doula got here and she labored with me a while, did a lot of counter pressure, which was so helpful. She got here around 5:30, and then the rest of my birth team showed up sort of randomly between 7 and 7:30 p.m. because they were all a bit further away. So it took them some time to get here. So when my midwife got here, I was really still in denial that I was in labor. And I remember saying, "I'm so afraid that it's going to stop and you're going to have to go home. And then I'll feel bad because you've all come here." And my midwife doesn't generally offer cervical checks in labor. It's not something she loves to do. But she did say, "Would it make you feel better if you know you've made progress?" I mean, she knew I was in labor. And I said yes. So I consented to a cervical check. And she said, "You're 7 centimeters, you're 100% effaced." She had just seen me hours prior that day when I was 4 centimeters. So obviously things were really happening. So they got the birth tub filled up in our bedroom, which was so nice and private. And I still labored outside of the tub while they were filling it up. And I got in the tub around 8 p.m. And not long after I got in, I started feeling the urge to push, which is something I had read a lot about and learned a lot about since my first birth and knew that I really wanted to wait for that this time. And so I started to push on my own, and it was just that uncontrollable urge to push. And she was born 30 minutes later in our tub in the bedroom and surrounded by people who loved us. And just that was one of the biggest differences is that we were surrounded by strangers in the hospital room with our first birth. We had 15 people in the hospital room. None of them knew us, and it was a more cold environment. And being in our home in, like, the warm lighting of the lamps and looking up and seeing only people that we knew who had walked this journey with us the second time and had the same goals that we did for our birth, I just felt so loved and so cared for, and it made such a big difference in my birthing experience.
Mhm. Redemption.
So redemptive. Absolutely.
So, you didn't think you were in labor, but what time was she born?
She was born at 8:30. Wife got to our house around 7 p.m. So, and then really until she checked me and told me I was 7 centimeters, I was still in denial. And then after she did that, I believed it. I was like, "Okay,
Yeah.
well, I am in labor then."
Guess this is it.
Yeah. I was 38 weeks and 4 days when Lorelai was born.
Wow, I've never had a baby that early, but
I
that sounds
know.
like a
Everybody
dream.
says that. My son was present. He was 3 years and 3 months old at the time, and he was so sweet. He stood outside the birth tub and held, like, an electric fan up for me, and he still talks about Lorelai's birth and loves to watch her birth video again, and I think it's really sweet that even though he was so little, there's still parts of it that he remembers.
Oh, that is really sweet. So then how did postpartum go for you since you were at home and baby was healthy and everything like everything was so smooth? Was it different the second time around?
Very different. It was a complete 180. Um, it could not have been more different. It was beautiful and redemptive and quiet. It was November of 2020, so people were still sort of scared outside of the home of COVID, and so we truly didn't have many visitors, and in some ways that can be sad, but at the same time, our space also felt very protected. So really the people that we had over were our immediate family. And we did have people that dropped off food for us, which was so helpful in those early days. But being at home and not in a different environment, not having to go anywhere and then drive home with your brand new baby, it was so different. Um, Remember with my first, it took me a couple of years to even be open to being pregnant and birthing again. Well, 12 hours after my birth with Lorelai, I moved to the living room couch that morning once our son woke up, and he was playing with Legos on the floor, and I was holding my new baby on the couch, and my husband was sitting across from me. And I remember looking up and saying, I can do that again.
Mm,
So just such a, when you have such a unique and different experience and it's redemptive and you feel so cared for, it can it can make you feel like you could do that again even so much sooner.
yeah.
Yeah.
So then at that point, where was your relationship with the Lord? I mean, we knew that it had gotten better after, a couple years after Rafe was born, but what was it like this time knowing that everything went so smoothly?
I felt like the Lord had given me a gift that I had not been promised by him because my birth could have gone very differently, but I felt like he had given me this beautiful gift. And yeah, I felt so cared for and loved by him. But also I had been in the journey of healing for a long time, and so it almost felt like the icing on the cake, like I had already gotten to this point of trusting and having faith in him. And so it was just like this little cherry on top that he added for me, and yeah, it was beautiful.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your stories. This has been so wonderful, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for letting me share.
Thanks again for joining us today. Be sure not to miss an episode by hitting subscribe. Also, we'd love for you to leave a review of the show so that more people like you can hear more stories like these. If you're local to the Triad of North Carolina and seeking childbirth classes, birth consultations, or a birth doula, please click on the link in the show notes to take you to our website for more information. Just as a reminder, this show is not giving medical advice, so please continue to see your personal care provider as needs arise. Also, if you would like to be a guest on the Surrendered Birth Stories podcast, please click the link in the episode show notes to get in touch with me. We hope you have a great week, and remember, learn all that you can, make the best plans, and then leave it in God's hands.